Um, I want to say good afternoon to everybody. I'm Joan Eisenberg, a Vice President of the Sisterhood of Hartzion Agudus Achim and Chairperson of today's program. Today, we will hear from 7 of our Sisterhood members who will relate their experiences growing up Jewish in America and Canada. We will go from the 1930s through the 1980s. Hence the title of this program, Lador Vador, from generation to generation. Let me introduce you to the Sisterhood members who have graciously agreed to be on our panel. And when I call your name, give a wave so that the audience will know who you are. Shirley Cowan is our current Sisterhood treasurer. Elaine Adler, I'm sorry that we can't see you, but Elaine is the current vice president of our Sisterhood. Diane Hamu Safarti is an esthetician who has generously shared her expertise with us during several of our past Sisterhood programs. Eileen Kramer is a past Sisterhood president. Marcy Friedman is a retired lawyer who, before COVID, was an active volunteer at the Hebrew Home. Tammy Korolnik is a research scientist who currently is a member of our congregation board of directors. Tammy grew up in Canada. Adrienne Susan is our congregation's program director, a teacher at her franchise, Rhythm and Ruach, and an indispensable member of our congregation staff. And I would be remiss if I did not point out that without Adrienne's technical expertise, this program could not happen. I give you my heartfelt thanks. During the presentations, if our audience has comments or questions, please put them in the chat. After the whole panel has completed their presentation, I will read the questions or comments. And if time permits, I will also ask the panel my own questions. So I'm going to start with Shirley Cowan. Shirley, would you start your presentation?
Yes. I was born in Baltimore in a very Jewish neighborhood. Most of my aunts and uncles and cousins were within a mile of our house. My grandparents lived only 5 doors away. And if you wanted to talk to somebody, you didn't call them on the phone, you went there, and not everybody had telephones. The doors were very seldom locked, and that was okay. I'm going to tell you first a little bit from the religious angle. And then, if you don't mind, I would like to read from something that I wrote about 20 years ago when I was asked to write or to speak to in my time frame. So I'll start out just telling you from the religious angle. Everybody was Jewish for blocks around. One of the fellas from where I was working said, if you went west of Fulton Avenue, they made you a bris. There were 2 shuls very nearby. One of them was a regular shul building, but the one that our family was part of was a house, and they cut out the middle of the 2nd floor to make a balcony for the women. I never heard of anything other than I don't understand that people are different, but it just the men went to shul more, not all the men, the women not so much. When it was time for shofar blazon, the girls would show up with their new dress for Rosh Hashanah. My mother did keep strictly kosher, and even if a knife got into the wrong drawer, it got buried in the ground for a while to kosher it. Um, we, I'm looking at my notes here, and I can't read my writing. On Shabbos. And we'd tear the toilet paper ahead of time. I know we did it on the high holidays. I don't for sure remember whether we did it every Shabbos or not. Um, so that gives you an idea. It was just a strictly Jewish neighborhood. I knew maybe two people that weren't Jewish. I really wasn't doing much with them or talking much with them, but I knew a couple that weren't Jewish. Um, so now I'd like to read some of this of how it was to grow up then, never mind whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. Um, every couple of days, a man with a, oh, it says my AOL account settings are out of date, it just told me. Every couple of days, a man with a wagon full of ice drove up the alley, and he would use a big set of tongs to deliver a 10 or 15-cent piece. My grandfather had an ice shaver and always kept chocolate syrup on hand. In the summer, he would make us chocolate snowballs. Milk was delivered to our door every morning. It wasn't homogenized, so you had to shake the bottle before pouring the milk. The cream would rise to the top, and in the winter, when it was very cold, the cream would expand and push up the lid of the bottle. Once or twice a week, a man whose name I still remember was Joe Collada would ride down the alley with his wagon selling fresh vegetables. There were no supermarkets. In the summer, hucksters would ride up and down the street selling watermelons, and they would sort of sing a little tune. Watermelons, red to the rind, all red. It was always that same tune, no matter how many different people. And before you bought a melon, the man would plug it for you. That means he cut a little wedge to show you how ripe it was. And if you didn't like that one, he would plug another for you until you were satisfied with the melon and decided to buy it. We had a friend who was a plumber and he owned a Model T Ford. And when he came to visit, we liked to watch him start his car. Instead of a starter on the dashboard, it had to be started by hand by cranking the motor with a handle on the front of the car. Back then, if you were in the house and you heard an airplane fly over, everybody would run outside to look at it. There were a lot of kids the same age on our block. When I was about 5 years old, several of the girls started a club. It was called the Jolly Sisters Club, and one of the teenagers in the neighborhood was our advisor. About that time, the stock market collapsed. I was about 4 years old, and the Depression started. I remember the day the banks were closed. I really was too young to understand the significance, but I knew that the grown-ups were all upset. I never saw people sleeping on the streets as the homeless do today, although I heard about hobos who traveled from one place to another looking for a job. I remember a man knocking on our door asking if he could work to get some food, and my mother made him a sandwich. She didn't give him any work to do. If people had no place to stay, their relatives would take them in. For a while, one of my aunts lived with us, and at different times, my mother's uncle lived with us. We didn't have any extra rooms. They slept on a cot in the dining room. And when money was tight, people couldn't pay their mortgages, and the banks arranged for them to pay only the interest until things got better. Wait a minute, I gotta get this page turned. All the elementary schools were neighborhood schools. You walked to school and you went home for lunch and then came back, unless it was raining or snowing. And then we had one sessions. You went to school, and instead of going home at 12 for lunch, you stayed until 1 and went home for the day. Um, there were two school systems in Baltimore, one for white people and one for colored people. And the neighborhoods were very segregated. About the only time you would see a colored child in a white neighborhood would be when they would come around offering to scrub your porch for a dime. Blacks and whites also went to separate restaurants, movies, etc. Across from our elementary school was a little candy store. A penny would buy a lot, such as 5 melted balls or a strip of candy dots or a long licorice stick. There were kids Oh, there was also a chocolate candy shaped like little people. They were called nigger babies, and we kids had no idea that that was an offensive thing. I have since wondered what they called them in the stores where the black people shopped. We didn't have a lot of money, but one day my mother happened to have 2 pennies in her apron pocket. She gave me both, and I felt so rich that day that I never forgot it. Junior high school. I went to an accelerated public junior high school where you did the work for seventh, eighth, and ninth grade in 2 years. The building was not built as a school, but was an old converted big house. There were 2 lockers, and there were no lockers, excuse me, no lockers, just coat rooms where you left your coats and other belongings. Nothing was ever missing except once. A fountain pen had disappeared from the coat room, and no one could go home until it was returned. The school was halfway across the city, and we went by streetcar. The fare was 5 cents. One Friday afternoon, my friend and I each had exactly 5 cents left after school, just enough for car fare. But we decided to buy ice cream from the vendor instead of the school and walk home. It was quite a walk, and our parents were not happy that we were late getting home, but it really was safe to walk in almost any neighborhood. We had another friend a few years later whose home was on the other side of a railroad underpass. It was dark and scary in the underpass. But if we saw another person there, a man or a woman, we weren't so scared because there was another human being there. We were never afraid that somebody was going to do us harm if they were there. Um, Although you could walk through any neighborhood, there were some places you didn't go. For example, and this specifically had to be religion, some beaches were restricted, which meant no Jews were allowed. Sometimes they had a sign, no Jews, or they didn't call it blacks then, no Jews or colored or dogs. About that time, the Jolly Sisters Club decided they had outgrown the name. We couldn't decide on a new name, so we called ourselves the Emanon Club, which was no name spelled backwards. We would sometimes argue when we planned a party whether to invite any boys. I think it was about that time that those who were in favor for the boys won for the first time. High school. Attended an all girls high school, and we all took schoolwork very seriously. I graduated at the age of 16, and by that time, around that time, our Emanon Club broke up. I hope to see a lot of the Emanon girls. This is written 20 years ago at our 60th reunion, which was planned for that October. Unfortunately, it was our last one because the girl that kept the records died, and that was the end of it. For entertainment, there was no television. We listened to the radio, the big floor model, and I still have it in my basement. Every Sunday evening, everybody listened to Jack Benny. We also went bowling to the movies, played step ball, played jacks, walked to the park to play tennis, talked a lot, and walked to the Arundel ice cream parlor to get ice cream Sundays. In the summer, especially, we played a lot of Monopoly, mostly on my friend's front porch. She had a lot of boy cousins, and by high school, they were interesting. The summer I got out of high school, our family went to on the first vacation I remember. We went to New York, and my cousin who lived there and his friends enjoyed taking me to the corner store to make everybody laugh because I said chocolate instead of chocolate as they did. We also went to Atlantic City, where the DuPont exhibit on the boardwalk was fascinating. I first saw a new product they were working on that was solid when it was still, but liquid when it was in motion. That turned out to be latex paint. They also demonstrated a glass tube that you could shine a light into and it would come out of the other end. That turned out to be fiber optics, which is big in communications now, of course. After that, I was lucky enough to have a job and I started taking some evening college classes, but the war broke out and the classes broke up. I graduated in June 1941, and December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. The next day, President, everyone who was alive at that time remembers where they were on Sunday, December the 7th, 1941. I was at a wedding. I was 16 years old when the war started and 20 when it was over. During the war, I was a volunteer at Sinai Hospital. Volunteers were much needed because so many of the nurses were in the service. I also became a junior hostess at, at the USO at the Jewish Y. The regular hostesses served donuts, coffee, etc., and the junior hostesses danced and hung out with the servicemen. Almost all of the fellows that we would normally have dated were in the service. All able bodied men up to the age of 38 were drafted if they hadn't already volunteered. During the war, there was rationing. Some of the items rationed were gasoline, shoes, meat, butter, and sugar. A Hershey bar was not to be found, nor were nylon stockings, which had just come on the market. The chocolate went into field rations for the servicemen and the nylon into parachutes. We did a lot of recycling of paper and cans. When the Allies invaded Normandy, many synagogues and churches, wait a minute, gotta get the page changed. Oh, nuts. There we go. Held special services that night to pray for the success of the invasion and the welfare of our fighting men. But when the war was finally over in 1945, there was a huge celebration everywhere, and everybody went to downtown Baltimore, and the whole city was downtown, and I saw this couple sitting on the curb resting in the crowd. All ages were down there celebrating. And by that time, I was no longer a teenager, and this was written for teenagers. So I guess that's about it. So there we are. I'm done.
Joan, you have to unmute.
Yeah. Thank you, Shirley. You've really given us a lot of information about that snapshot in time when you were growing up. And I found it very interesting. Our next presenter is Elaine Adler. Elaine, unmute yourself and it's all yours.
Elaine,
She's muted and
you want me to call her?
Unmute. You hear me?
yes, now I can, Elaine.
Okay.
So it's your
Okay.
turn.
Okay, well, I said hi, everybody, and I'm not going to repeat some things because Shirley already said it about the milk delivery. I won't do that, but I do want to say that I think about things that meant a lot to me is like after Shabbos, we lived around the corner. Well, first of all, I was born in Coney Island in a place called Seagate, and I was really, a baby. And then when I was about 2 or 3, somewhere around there, my parents moved to Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, I can remember when I was in the 1st grade, and that's where, things happened that weren't so nice. And we're talking about Judaism here and living in a Jewish neighborhood. I did live in a Jewish neighborhood as much as I understood. So I walked with my brother, the rabbi, which he wasn't then, and he was older than I. And so he went with his friends once he delivered me at the school. However, one day when my brother wasn't there, the school was surrounded, and these 2 little Gentile girls grabbed me and hid me away because certain people at the school, this is an elementary school now, wanted to get the little Jew girl. Now, I know I didn't really know anybody that well because we did live in a Jewish neighborhood, but where I walked to school, I mean, I don't know who was Jewish or what was Jewish. I was too young to think about those things. But that was very terrifying. So they hid me under the stairwell at the school in the basement. And after 4 o'clock, when there were no more children left, they took me home. So that's one memory that I have. But then I loved when after Shabbos after Shabbos, but no matter what time it was, because like in June, Shabbos isn't over till 9:30. And so the bakery doesn't start cooking till 11 o'clock. But my mother and I, we would go to the bakery to get the fresh pumpernickel rolls that they made, because they were really, really special. And then what I loved about my neighborhood, which we haven't seen, I've never seen it again since I married and came to Washington. But in Philadelphia, we had a store that only sold cheese. Everything was kosher, only cheese and butter. And there was no such thing as getting 4 quarters with salt. Everything was fresh, cut with a looked like a saw, but it was laid out like a cake. And they would cut you 1/4 pound, 1/2 pound, but it was sweet butter, fresh made. It was called Sailors, that store, and it
Yeah.
was next door to actually a food fair, which was a what do you call it,
Supermarket.
a supermarket. Thank you. Yeah. So, but my mother and I, then on during the week, my mother would take me on Wednesdays after school. We would go to the kosher butcher, and then we would go to the fishmonger, and then we would go to the vegetable store. And I enjoyed those things, and everything was fine there. However, I happened to be very Jewish and proud of it. But it got in my school, I was singing from the time I was 2. And I don't know if you all remember Betty Hutt. And she was singing the song Murder, Murder, he says, every time we kiss. And it was a real cute song, but I could imitate her. So even some of these Gentile kids who were anti, they would surround me and make me imitate Betty Hutton. So that was a sweet thing. Then Natalie, God bless her, from our shul, we happened to live in the same neighborhood, but I lived on the Goyish side because my parents didn't know when they bought the house, when we, in Philly, that it wasn't the Jewish side. So, I didn't have that much trouble with the neighborhood. I had 3 girlfriends that were Gentile. I didn't have any Jewish friends on my side. I had my cousin who lived on the Jewish side, and she was 2 years ahead of me, but she still let me go with her. We went out together, went to shul together, whatever. But we had, it was just that these 3 girls that said to me, Elaine, we like you very much, but really we can't talk to you anymore because you killed our Lord. I don't know for how many years it was, but every year for Good Friday, they went to Catholic school, I went to public school. So every year when Good Friday came around, and the Catholics, were, at that time they did say the Jews killed Jesus. Now they say it's the Romans, which it was. However, so they didn't talk to me for a month, and that was very, very difficult for me to comprehend, because how can you be my friend? But I would say to them, but I wasn't even thought of. My parents weren't even thought of. But anyway, things worked out because it's every year after a month, then they would play with me. That was another thing. But Natalie and I, the reason I mentioned her is we went to the same public school, elementary school, and she too had encountered things. We both had, I was ahead of her, and she, but we remember these teachers in the elementary school, and this one teacher, every day there was a Bible reading. You saluted the flag, you sang the Star Spangled Banner, and she would read from the Bible, the New Testament, and she always read this one line we should not act like the hypocrites do in the synagogue. Every single day that she read, which was most of the time, and that is in their New Testament, in the St. Matthew's section. It's the sixth thing, written in that particular part of their Bible. And so and so Natalie and I recalled this and talk about it. And then we had a teacher, Mrs. Donnelly, was a witch with a capital B, and she hated Jews with a, so we got her good because there was a little boy that was from an Orthodox home, and the child wore his yarmulke every single day. He slept in his yarmulke. She tells him to take it off. The little boy refused. She went to pull it off his head, and he started to cry. So with this, I told my parents, and Natalie must have told, whatever it is, we had her arrested. First of all, she wasn't supposed to tell him, as a teacher, you would think that she knows that Jewish people, men wear yarmulkes, so do women. But that was not a good experience. But Natalie and I, we did experience that with Miss Donnelly, but we did make her pay for that. And then I moved on to the middle school, and I met this Jewish girl, and we became fast friends, and we still talk to each other, even though she went to a school called Frankfurt High School in the Frankfurt section of Philly, and I went to Olney High School, and I traveled for almost an hour to get there. But that school was mostly all Jewish. As a matter of fact, I used to go to the synagogue at the corner where my Olney High School was the shul, and that's where I was married to Alan Alvasholem. So it sticks in my mind. But I had a good time in that school, in the high school. But in this little girl that went on to Frankfurt High School, she and her sister were the only Jews in that high school. But her parents came over much later when they were older with the children from the old country. And so they didn't understand. And her parents, they only had to take one trolley to go to Frankfurt High School. But they were the only Jews there. And we talk about it to this day, which is 70 years ago. And remember, we laugh about it because, she and I, we spoke Yiddish all the time, and not intentionally, but we love to speak Yiddish. But not so she felt bad when she went to Frankfurt High, and then I went to Olney High. But we kept in touch, and she lives in Florida now, and we talk on the phone all the time, and we laugh about these things that went on. But I was especially very sensitive to the way certain teachers reacted to children who were Jewish. I don't know.
Adrian, Elaine, one more
Stop.
minute,
Time's up.
one more minute.
Oh, so anyway, thank you all for listening. I think this is a great thing Joni has done, and that I can tell you all my little stories. But you see, I did survive, but I did have fun imitating Betty Hutton, if you all know her. I remember her. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Joni.
Thank you, Elaine, and I have heard you sing, and you do have a lovely voice. Thank you for sharing your memories with us. I appreciate it. Diane, you're next.
Okay. First of all, I see my sister, Ida, and Fred from Minneapolis, my brother, Steve, from St. Paul, and my dear friend, Karen, from Minneapolis, who lives now in DC. So thanks, gang. My name is Diane Krovitz Hamoud Sarfati. That's a real mouthful. Although I'm not a public speaker, I'm honored to tell you about my Jewish life in the Midwest. I was born and raised in Duluth, Minnesota, which is situated at the tip of Lake Superior. Our small city had a population of 87,000. 4,000 were Jewish immigrants, and most came from Lithuania. People assumed our family arrived through Ellis Island, but most European immigrants traveled through Canada and the Great Lakes. My great-grandparents on my mother's side arrived around 1886, and my father's side in 1912, thank God. My Zeta Goldish owned the Lake Superior Fish Company. He transported crates of fish on his boat for the city of Duluth and surrounding states. He was a quiet, humble, successful man who also saved 29 lives in our vicious lake and did much for our shul. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but this is how cold it gets on Lake Superior. And this was how they moved their freight around. My Boban Zeta on my father's side mainly spoke Yiddish. To this day, one of my biggest regrets was not being able to converse with them much, other than the tremendous amount of hugs and kisses that were showered on us. At the turn of the century, many Jewish immigrants started small stores in dry goods. The Orakovsky family started this way and progressed to opening a beautiful department store, and then they manufactured the Orak vacuum. Another name you may know is Shabtai Zissel. He was born in Duluth 13 years before me and went by the name of Robert Zimmerman or Bob Dylan. Our little town at one point had 9 synagogues. By the time I came along in '54, there was only 1 Orthodox shul, 1 conservative synagogue, and 1 Reform temple. Our family belonged to Adas Israel, the Orthodox shul, or as it was nicknamed, the 3rd Street Shul. The other 2 were on 2nd Street and 4th Street. How funny is that? Our shul was built in 1901 and was designed after the synagogues in Lithuania. I don't have a picture offhand, but the Israel Museum in Jerusalem has a model of our exact synagogue. What a gorgeous building it was. Every window was encased in stained glass. The Aron HaKodesh seemed to reach the heavens, and warm, curved wooden benches filled the main sanctuary and balcony. Every time a woman entered or left the balcony, the floor would creak, so we knew exactly who came late and who left early. Full capacity was 400 people, and as a young child, there was standing room only for many high holidays. When the sun would beam through the stained glass or thunder and lightning would make the lights flicker, we would say the old souls came back to be with us. Our shul was the center of our Jewish lives. Every ceremony, simcha, was celebrated as a community with food and drink. If a member did not have family, they were included as family. Our little shtetl, as we called it, was our home. Everyone was related to each other some way or another. Older members would constantly ask me if I knew how we were related, and they would proceed to tell me that they were second cousins on my mother's side, making me a third cousin. I really couldn't follow them at my age and wasn't too interested until I grew up. My father was a very active millionaire and also served as shul president. His smile, laughter, and davening was infectious. I used to light up when he would head to the bima to say the Kohanim priestly blessings to our congregation. You could say he was a Jack Katz, a Dan Gorand, or Aaron Label, in picking up and dropping off members to make sure there was a minyan, because St. Kaddish was the most important thing to my father. My mother served as sisterhood president and very active in social, humanitarian, and charitable causes. She was an awesome mother who juggled many hats. The best adventures in our shul were up in the women's balcony. When my cousins arrived, we would talk about anything and everything until my grandmother turned around and yelled, "Shah!" And that embarrassing moment did us in. We had such a great view from above, and as teens, we did little praying and a little more boy watching. Girls didn't have bat mitzvahs, even though our Hebrew was better than the boys and voices less squeaky. There were no day schools in Duluth. I attended Hebrew school twice a week and Sunday school, along with clarinet and piano lessons. I made a deal with my mom that if I kept up with all my lessons, I could ice skate a few evenings per week. It was a win-win situation. Elementary school was semi-uneventful. There were a few racial slurs, even at my young age, but no violence as we see today. I felt penalized not being able to sing in the Christmas pageant. There were only a few of us who were Jewish, and we had to sit in our class working on our homework instead of singing. I was very fortunate to be able to attend Herzl Camp in Wisconsin. My 2 summers were life-changing at this Zionist camp, where my love of Israel and Jewish beliefs deepened. In junior high, I joined Young Judea, also a Zionist youth movement. High school was B'nai B'rith Girls and BBYO. These were also wonderful youth leadership organizations. At 15, I attended my first BBYO dance. My dearest Minneapolis friend, hi Karen, that night we dumped our dates and became lifelong friends. By the time I hit 16, I had a deep desire to go to Israel. Many of my friends were planning the first year of college, and I decided to spend my first year in Eretz Yisrael. My parents let all 5 of their children chart their own courses and were supportive of me. Gay gesundter hate. After saving my hard-earned money, I embraced our beautiful country, traveled north to south, experienced kibbutz and ulpan life, and met Israeli family members who are a big part of my life today. My kibbutz sister was from Silver Spring, and that's how I ended up in this area. My parents always tried to shelter us from the sadness in life, but as a teen, I tried to read everything I could about the Holocaust. I was deeply touched by our survivors. I know there were hardships in raising our large family, but we were taught how important tzedakah was, feeding everyone in need and trying to do 1 mitzvah a day. We were the minority in our town, but strength always grew in our home and shul. My siblings still speak about how lucky we were to have had parents who evoke such chesed, loving kindness. After the loss of my husband, we decided to have my middle son's bar mitzvah in Duluth. It was a meaningful Shabbat for all who traveled to join in our simcha, and I'm thankful for that. And I have one small world story. Over the years, our shul membership unfortunately got a lot smaller due to people moving to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Milwaukee, as my siblings did. We had chazans who were hired for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. At least 20 years ago, my father, Zichrono Livracha, told me that our shul had a wonderful Hamisha chazan who traveled to Duluth for the high holidays. Since I moved to Silver Spring in 1974, I didn't get back to Duluth for every holiday. But when I did, I had a chance to meet this chazan with the wonderful voice, and his name was Ben Bazian, our Ben Bazian. My husband then became the Sephardic chazan 10 years after that, along with others. And my husband used to entice membership by cooking the holiday meals. So we did get some more members. I received a phone call on September 9th, 2019 at 4:30 a.m. from my sister who was sobbing. Our beautiful Adas Israel shul, still chokes me up, was destroyed due to arson. This loss was felt throughout the world. Israel reported within hours. Every magnificent stained glass window melted. Our Aron HaKodesh burned to the ground. A few of our Torahs on the lower level were saved, but not kosher anymore. This magnificent 118 years of history was gone in a matter of hours. Some members who witnessed the fire said, "This is what Kristallnacht must have felt like." Also, there were 4 benches that were miraculously not burned up by fire, and one was my father's. And that was a powerful message to me. I want to end by showing you a 20-second clip of my husband, Bezalel, blowing the shofar in Adas Israel. This is how we would leave Duluth and say goodbye to our shul. It's from September 8th, 2013. And I hope you can hear the echo in the sanctuary. Thank you all.
Thank you, Diane. That was a powerful presentation, a very, very heartfelt presentation. And I'm sure that everybody that heard you felt the same as me. Now, Eileen Kramer, you're up next.
Okay, unmuted myself. My name's Eileen Kramer, and I was raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1950s and 60s. My mother is a native of Tulsa. Her parents immigrated to Tulsa from Poland in the early 1920s. My grandmother started the Heva Kadesher in Tulsa. That's my claim to fame. Today's Tulsa Jewish community is vibrant and thriving. Along with a Chabad house, there are 2 synagogues, a conservative congregation and a reform congregation. My mother was raised at the conservative congregation, but when she married my father, he was reformed, so our family was a reform congregation, went to the reform congregation. The Jewish community supports the Jewish preschools, a Schechter day school, a Jewish community center with a museum, and a Jewish retirement community. Tulsa Jews have helped to build many institutions in Tulsa, such as the Gathering Place. A man by the name of George Kaiser has built a large educational and recreational facility on the Arkansas River there. Tulsa Jews now support the 2 museums in Tulsa, which is Philbrook Art Museum and Gilcrease Museum of Western Art. They support the University of Tulsa, the Tulsa Opera, Tulsa Philharmonic, and Ballet. This is not the Tulsa I grew up in. The Tulsa I grew up in had only 2 synagogues. With the discovery of oil around the city of Tulsa in the early 1900s, many Jews came to Tulsa. This is the reason my grandfather came. He was a window washer and felt that he was told by people in Omaha, Nebraska, that Tulsa would be a great place for a window washer because they were building lots of office buildings there. There were 4, when I was growing up, there were 4 local department stores in Tulsa, and 2 of them were owned by Jewish families. Many of the Jews that I grew up with, their families were in the oil business, or they had businesses that supported the oil industry. The Jews of Tulsa really did help build Tulsa. Tulsa was also a quiet Ku Klux Klan town until World War II. The war brought lots of outsiders to Tulsa because of the oil and aviation industries. I don't recall Jews being bothered, but we were a quiet group. As a child, I thought that a sukkah was an indoor structure. Our synagogue always had it indoors. No one put it up a sukkah outdoors. We prevented damages before they could happen. When Southern Hills Country Club, a prestigious PGA golf course, was built in Tulsa in the 1960s, Jews were not allowed to join. However, when they built the club, they also developed residential properties surrounding the club, and access to these homes were granted through the main country club entrance. Many of the residents were purchased by Jewish people. Many times in my childhood, classmates would tell me that I was the first Jew they ever met. Once a classmate asked to see my horns. I came home and I asked my father that evening, why did this boy think I had horns? I could see my father was upset. And then he sighed and explained that the artist Michelangelo had done a statue of Moses and put horns on him because the Christian translation for the words for rays was mistranslated as horns. As a Reformed Jews, my family attended Shabbos services on Friday evenings. You know, we always had the expression that we were so religious, we closed our shul on Saturday. We attended religious school, but not my sisters and I, but we did not attend Hebrew school. As a teen, I later took adult Hebrew school classes because I wanted to. When I was growing up, and when we were in middle school, we had Delta Devs. It was a Jewish girl club, and we didn't do much of anything but have meetings, and I just, it was just a social kind of thing. When we got into high school, we went into B'nai B'rith girls, and by the time I was a senior, the reform movement had also developed a group called Nifty, and so I belonged to that. Our family celebrated all the Jewish holidays, but we did it in the Reform style. Like Sukkot was celebrated on the Friday night of whenever Sukkah was. We didn't do a separate Sukkah service. The same thing for Shavuos. The only holidays that were celebrated when they're supposed to be celebrated were Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Passover. Other than that, it was like when, Hanukkah was celebrated, and I mean, but you don't go to synagogue for that, but it was always celebrated around the Friday that it occurred. And to this day, I want to let you know that at my family synagogue in Tulsa, they don't even know what a kosher meal looks like. They will still serve you meat and cheese at the same time. Nobody cares. But I want to say that I think I was fortunate to have grown up in Tulsa when I did, because it was a time of a lot of major social changes. And by the time I attended college in Tulsa, Tulsa had become a more welcoming place for minorities. And that's why I think that it was one of the reasons why Tulsa is as thriving as it is now, is because people will, willingly move there and want to resettle in a place that is more open and accepting of everyone. And that's it.
Thank you, Eileen. I didn't know all these things about you. I've known you for years and years, and I didn't know, and I'm so glad that you shared your experiences with us. And I'm glad you found your way to a conservative synagogue, and obviously now you celebrate the holidays when they
They really
supposed to
occurred.
be celebrated. Yes. Our next presenter will be Marcy Friedman.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My title of my little talk is Growing Up Jewish in a Small Town in Western Pennsylvania. And I might add a very small town compared to other people here. I grew up in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, a small town about 50 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. There were about 20 or so Jewish families in a town of about 12,000 people at that time. The Jewish families all had businesses in and around the area. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, the Jewish families in Connellsville got together and purchased a building that they could use as a synagogue. Since there were so few Jews in town, the synagogue was only used for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The community would hire a student rabbi from the conservative seminary in New York City to lead the services for the 3 days. Since my parents kept a kosher kitchen, one of the few in town, we would always have the rabbi for several of the meals during Rosh Hashanah. Friday nights, my mother always made a big Shabbat dinner. We always lit candles, and my father would recite the blessings over the wine and challah. After dinner, my father would sit by himself to recite the grace after meals, while my mother, sister, and I cleaned up. Sometimes we would go to my grandparents in Mount Pleasant, a town about 12 miles north of Connellsville, for Shabbat dinner. Even though we rarely went to services on Saturday morning, we always had a big Saturday Shabbat lunch. With no morning or evening minyan around, my father davened every morning by himself before going to work. For Friday night services, Saturday services, and other Jewish holidays, we would occasionally go to Uniontown, which was about 12 miles south of Connellsville. Uniontown at that time had a conservative synagogue and a Reform synagogue located within 2 blocks of each other. Uniontown also had a large Jewish community center used by all the Jewish communities in the surrounding area. My parents made friends with several Jewish families in surrounding towns who also came to the Jewish Community Center's swimming pool in the summer. Both the Reform and Conservative synagogues in Uniontown had Sunday schools. About 3 families from Connellsville and 1 family from Scottdale, a small town about 6 miles north of Connellsville, got together and formed a carpool on Sundays to take their children to Sunday school in Uniontown. I was the only one who went to the conservative synagogue. The others went to the Reform synagogue. I was also the only one who went to the conservative after-school Hebrew school, which met Tuesdays and Thursdays. Since there was no carpool for Hebrew school, my parents decided that I would only attend 1 of the 2 days per week. For big holidays like Passover, Purim, and Thanksgiving, we would get together with my grandparents or uncle, or with my aunt and her family from Pittsburgh. We would either go to their house or they would come to ours. Hanukkah was generally spent at home with an occasional meal with my grandparents or with my relatives from Pittsburgh. I think Christmas time was a challenge for my parents. My father's business was decorated for Christmas. In order to balance the Christmas-Hanukkah season, my parents would always decorate the living room of our house with dreidels, Jewish stars, and a really big Happy Hanukkah sign. We went to Pittsburgh quite often to buy kosher meat and food, and at Passover to buy Passover products. My parents had 2 large stand-alone freezers to keep all the kosher food and meat. Of course, when we went to Pittsburgh, my parents would also buy kosher meat and food for my grandparents in Mount Pleasant. With our food shopping trips to Pittsburgh, I often got to see my Pittsburgh relatives. Occasionally, my mother and I would spend Friday night in Pittsburgh with my relatives. Staying overnight with my aunt or cousins gave my mother and me a chance to go to my aunt's synagogue in Pittsburgh on Saturday mornings. The sanctuary at the synagogue was very large, beautiful, and in the round, and they had a wonderful choir that would accompany the cantor. My mother also liked to go to Pittsburgh to celebrate Sukkot at my aunt's synagogue, since it gave us a chance to eat in a sukkah. Growing up, I had practically no Jewish friends. Although I knew a few Jewish children from Uniontown from Sunday school and Hebrew school, they were only acquaintances, not friends. I was the only Jewish child in my entire elementary school, and I think also in middle and high school. The other children in our Sunday school carpool were much younger than I, so there was no one my age that was Jewish. Out of over 500 graduating seniors from my high school, I was the only Jewish teenager. I do not recall anyone ever saying anything negative directly to me growing up about being Jewish, but I know everyone knew that I was that little Jewish girl. Since my parents would not let me go out on a date with anyone who was not Jewish, and there's nobody Jewish in Connellsville, I had only 3 dates while in high school. One date was for a winter school dance that was held in the school cafeteria my junior year. I was on a committee that helped design and decorate part of the cafeteria for the dance. After all that hard work designing and decorating the cafeteria, I told my mother I was going to the school dance. I had to invite the son of one of my parents' friends that they had met at the Jewish Community Center. He lived 30 miles away. For my other 2 dates, My cousins in Pittsburgh insisted that I come into Pittsburgh to meet one of their friends' sons. I do not recall my parents having too many Jewish friends that they socialized with. They did play gin rummy with 3 other Jewish couples from Connellsville once a month for a few years. They also would occasionally get together with one of the Jewish families from nearby towns that they had met at the Jewish Community Center in Uniontown. I do not recall them socializing with any non-Jewish couples. There were no Jewish women groups in the area that I know of, so I do not recall my mother ever going to or joining Hadassah or Mizrahi, which is now Amit, even though my aunt in Pittsburgh was very active in Mizrahi. The only thing I do remember was that if a member of the Jewish community in Connellsville had a death in the family, all the Jewish women in Connellsville would get together and make a Shiva meal for the family. And everyone in the Jewish community in Connellsville would go to that person's house for services for the entire Shiva week. My father did occasionally go to the men's B'nai B'rith meeting group with other Jewish men from several surrounding Western Pennsylvania towns. I think the men's group had originally formed when my father was a teenager growing up in Mount Pleasant. When I was about 16 years old, a few of the Jewish teenagers in Mount Pleasant, where my grandparents lived, wanted to start a B'nai B'rith group and asked me to join. I only recall having about 3 or 4 meetings before everyone lost interest. When I was about 15, the Jewish community of Connellsville decided they were no longer interested in maintaining a building that was only used 3 days a year. So they sold the synagogue to a church. After the synagogue in Connellsville was sold, we stayed with my grandparents and uncle in Mount Pleasant for the high holidays. Mount Pleasant also had a synagogue that only functioned on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Unfortunately, the synagogue in Mount Pleasant was sold to a church a number of years later when the chief supporter of the synagogue died. With the disappearance of Jews from Uniontown and other small cities in Western Pennsylvania, the 2 synagogues and the Jewish Community Center in Uniontown have also closed and have been sold to churches. Sadly, the large synagogue my aunt went to in Pittsburgh was also sold to a church.
Thank you, Marcy. It's amazing, really, to listen to your story that your family persevered and Judaism survived, I know, through you. And give yourself a big pat on the back for that. Our next presenter will be Tammy Korolnik. Tammy is from Canada.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation just to help me remember what I wanted to cover. Okay. So I wanted to give a little background about Toronto and Jewish Toronto. So Toronto is the biggest city in Canada, and it's actually the 15th largest Jewish metropolitan area in the world. So we go from small town to one of the biggest Jewish cities on the planet. There's a record of Jewish presence in Toronto since 1817. So I guess one of my themes is just how lucky I was to be born into a city that had all these Jewish establishments in place. So, you know, Jewish schools, kosher food, Jewish schools, Jewish summer camps, all sorts of institutions that have already been in place. So to say thank you to previous generations and the work they did to set that up. Okay, so in the mid-1800s, the first Jewish cemetery and first synagogue was founded, and you know there are a ton this day. Originally, the Jewish community settled downtown in a place called the Ward and Kensington Market that are still, the market's still in use today. The Jewish community went through, it became Chinese immigrants moved there, And now it's sort of a hip, you can buy retro clothes, and there's still food. There's up and coming restaurants down there. So it's still a vibrant area. And then you just have various waves of migration starting in the 1800s, but even to this day, anytime a Jewish community goes through a crisis, you'll get migration. So starting with Eastern European and Russian Jews, you have Sephardic Jews coming from North Africa, the Middle East, Iran. South African Jews came over when there were issues, newer waves of Russian Jews coming over, and even a lot of Jews from Montreal when there are issues in Quebec with freedom of religion and, you know, anytime there's a problem. So even Montreal Jews immigrated to Toronto, making it this strong, vibrant Jewish capital. And I have this picture. So a lot of the Jews started off, the first generation, you know, are sort of laborers. They open up shops, they work in factories, you open a bakery or a deli. So some of these institutions are still here today. So this is the United Bakers, started by the Ladovsky family from Kilts in 1912, and it exists today. It's not hechshered, but it's still like dairy. They don't serve meat and milk together. And there are a number of bakeries that have been open for decades. So I'm gonna start with my story. My mother's side is the Feintuch family. And over here, this is my grandmother, Rose Ruchu, and her two sisters. So they survived the labor camps together. My grandmother was with one of her sisters, and then they met up with another sister after the war. So this is them at her wedding in a displaced persons camp. And this is them at my uncle's bar mitzvah. So just the shift from where they, you know, ended up to what they were able to build, just, you know, having a beautiful bar mitzvah, beautiful dresses, you know, just what they were able to build family-wise. And this is her with her great-grandson's bar mitzvah in Israel. So, sorry, getting emotional. And then on my other side is the Korolnik side, that's my father. Over here we have, on the top is my great-grandfather and great-grandmother, Itchemeyer and also Toba Korolnik. So he came over in the early 1900s and started as like a bottle recycler. He would collect glass bottles, wash them, and resell them. And that became a packaging business called Consolidated Bottle that's still existing today. And their son is my grandfather. So that's Harry Korolnik. And this is his wedding to my grandmother, Mary Korolnik. And she had a clothing import company.
I
So
don't see that. I don't see the wedding.
No. You can't see? Okay, let me. Okay.
Get rid of the chat.
No,
Then you're gonna block some stuff. Okay.
but do you see it?
Yes.
Oh,
Oh, you do see
my
it?
husband
Okay.
tells me that the chat is in the way. So that's
Okay,
why.
all right. Okay. All right. So, oop. No, it won't move. Okay. Can we see now? Grade school? Okay. So my great-grandfather, Itchemeyer, and his sons worked to help build new institutions in the city, and one of them was a school called HTAA Schools. And it's a school that both my parents, all my aunts and uncles, me, my brother, all my cousins on both sides, we were all able to go to the same school. And this is the building of the, sorry, of the building that I went to school in. And the shul we went to was also Orthodox shul was attached. So it was Viewmount Shul and HTAA Schools. So it was established as the Poilische Talmud Torah with one classroom, and then grew to be this multiple campus school to sustain Orthodox Jewry in the city. And my age group was mostly third generation. So, you know, our grandparents had come over, you know, before or after the war. Our parents were the second generation who they had already built some things together, and we came and we just were able to take for granted everything that had been built for us. So over here, I have a picture of, I don't know if the chat's covering this one, but on the far right in the middle, that's me. This is 1993, 94, grade 5. And these were the uniforms we wore in the school. And actually the only really times I remember experiencing any anti-Semitism was when I would wear the school uniform. So I guess people recognize that that's a Jewish school, and maybe it stood out a bit more. And there were, like, I don't know, got called names sometimes in the street, but that was pretty rare. But that was the only time that happened. Okay. I started off high school in a school called Beis Yaakov. So there was a movement in Orthodox Judaism to educate Jewish girls. So the boys always went to Cheder, Talmud Torah, they were supposed to learn, but there was a new movement to educate the girls as well. And this was a school that my mother attended as well. And there were sort of new conflicts arising at this time, kind of in the 90s, where the Orthodox community was growing and sort of had built all these institutions, and it started to encompass a different spectrum even within Orthodoxy. And it sort of became a clash of how to deal with, the school, what rules should the school have, how should we dress, what happens if, parents allow their daughters to dress differently. So there were girls who started there and ended up leaving because of these rules. The school was sort of wanted to shelter us and keep us in a stricter dress code, stricter behavior code. But that became an issue when you want to attract people from all of Orthodoxy, because they might not follow the same rules that you do. So at this point, we had the luxury of infighting. It wasn't survivors coming together to build something, and you could fight over. You wouldn't want to have these fights. You just wanted to be a united community. It was at this point where you could start, I'm going to build my own school, and I'm going to move to a different school. There were issues of sort of the mandated curriculums. I remember being taught, evolution, but the preface being, you don't have to believe this. This is what we're forced to teach you. We're being taught literature where it was a photocopied version of a Shakespeare play. There were certain lines we couldn't read. And then we had to sign like an agreement that we wouldn't watch TV. So their response to, I guess, changes in wider culture was to get more sheltered, and there's an argument to that, to protect Judaism from, more progressive liberal forces. And they didn't want you to go to university. So that was another difference. And I ended up switching to a different high school that had a different approach. They were like, we want you out in the world. We want to strengthen your, your ability to go out in the world and still remain an Orthodox Jew. So we had more of a dress code instead of a uniform, and they were very pro-education and very pro-Israeli. So it was a Zionist school, and their philosophy was more to engage in the modern world. But then you have, the flip side is you're exposing students to a lot more forces out there. So that's, I think, a tension that has existed, since the Haskalah, since Judaism has opened up to modern society. How progressive or how sheltered do you want to be? After high school, again, we were lucky enough to be able to afford and to have these institutions already set up in Israel. It's very common for Orthodox Jews to spend a year in Israel. So I went to a school called Michala Jerusalem College for Girls. And it's depending on where you were in Orthodoxy, it was preparing you for married life or preparing you to go to university and still hold on to your belief and your culture. And we also we're lucky enough to build ties with, I went to school with girls from all over the States, from London, from Gibraltar. So that was a really wonderful opportunity. And I just was remembering, we arrived in August 2001. And it was just weeks before the 9/11 attacks. And it was such a bizarre experience to go through that with girls who are from New York, who knew people there. but it also meant that I was protected from seeing a lot of the images. Like we didn't have a television, so I luckily didn't, I don't know. It was definitely an experience. Okay. After your year in Israel, I ended up going to a school called York University. So this is a public research university. It's the third largest one in Canada, and that's where I did my biology degree. And it was the first time that I was in a classroom with that wasn't just all Jewish girls. So it was a huge shift. I have a picture here of the fashions in the time in 2002, 2003. And you know, you'd see a lot of people around you and like the low-rise jeans with everything hanging out, and it was just kind of a shock. But I also I remember working in a lab with a girl who was Sikh, and we just bonded over just, you know, we had our own foods and our own traditions, and it was nice to see people who are open to like learning about Judaism and my own traditions. So it was definitely culture shock. I was lucky enough to kind of be in this Jewish protective world for so long, but on the other hand, it was good as well. So that, I guess, future trends and issues that are an issue in Orthodoxy, and not just in Orthodoxy. I think every stream of Judaism has this issue of balance between preserving Judaism while engaging with the modern world. And something I also came across and didn't bring up yet, but the internet kind of became popular as I was in grade school and high school. And I'm seeing now sort of Orthodox Jews are taking it and making it their own and being able to represent themselves. So I have over here, there's, like on Instagram, I follow Orthodox Jews and even just regular Jewish accounts. Like it brings people together in a way that like I always felt as I had to wear skirts and I had all these weird traditions. I always felt like a little weird that I didn't belong in the world. And it seems like now there's representation. You know, I see Jewish films and Jewish TV shows. So just having the internet to gather and build things, making that a lot easier. And one thing that since the pandemic, one of the things I've taken on myself is I'm taking classes in Yiddish through this YIVO Institute, which goes back, it's a secular Yiddish institute. It goes back to Eastern Europe, and they still exist today, and they can do it over Zoom. So they're in New York, but you can take classes on Zoom. And it's just making me think about Yiddish culture, how, you know, for thousands of years, Ashkenazic Jews have spoken Yiddish. And my grandparents did. My dad's father was born in Toronto, but spoke with a accent because he just was surrounded by the Yiddish culture. And to maybe, I don't know, start a movement to hold on to that a bit more. And certainly I myself am taking it upon me to hold on to that. So thank you all for listening. Thank you, Joan, for inviting me, and the Sisterhood and HTAA for bringing me here to share a little bit of my story. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tammy. That was so interesting. And I have to say, you know, you coming to that Yiddish, the internet place, my grandson, all of a sudden, last week, we heard that he tells us that he is on that same website as you, and he wants to learn Yiddish. So it's nice to hear that you are doing it too. I appreciate your presentation and the time you put into it. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least is our own Adrienne Susan. So Adrienne.
Hi, thank you very much, Joan, for having me. My name is Adrienne Susan, for those who don't know me, but I have a feeling most of you do know me on this Zoom call. I really have been fascinated by everything I've been listening to. It has been so neat to listen of all the generations, and I personally have found connections through all of you that I didn't even potentially know about, you know, with Diane and knowing some people out in Minnesota, excuse me, and then also with Eileen in Tulsa. I have family in Tulsa. I had no idea that, you know, about Nifty, and I was a part of Nifty a little bit. So it's very neat to listen to everybody and say, just like Tammy said, thank you for all of your family's hard work to allow myself and people like Tammy to have a little bit more freedom because of, and have a little more different experiences and new experiences. So that being said, I am from Denver, Colorado, which most of you probably know. I grew up in a very southeast suburban area in a very well-known, well-established synagogue. I'm fifth generation Colorado, meaning that my family's been there for over 100 years. So I have been very blessed, and I was actually going to share my screen so I could show you, because I would not be here without these two adorable people on the right hand side there. Those are my parents. My mom is actually on the Zoom call. So hi, Mom, and thanks for having me. That one on the left is me. I was born in '86, and I have two older brothers. One of them you might have heard of. He is your rabbi and our rabbi. And we had a very wonderful lifestyle. Every Friday night, we had Shabbos dinner. We weren't allowed to go out on Friday nights growing up. We had to stay home. We went on vacations. We had, you can see we had a sukkah in our backyard that we built every year. All of us together built and decorate, and my aunt would come over, and other family members throughout the years would come over and help us because my dad needed all the help he could get. He wasn't as savvy in that department as my aunt and others were, so he would always use that help. We went on so many vacations. You can see in the middle, that was my 7th birthday. My family, we went to Disneyland, which was amazing. And growing up, I went to, I'm going to stop share now. Growing up, I went to Herzl Jewish Day School, which is now Denver Jewish Day School, which is a Solomon Schechter-like-esque program, very similar to what JDS is like out here as well. So I grew up everything was normal, everything was common. I started out in a preschool at a synagogue. I'll show you my cute little preschool photo here. There's me over there, little Adrian. And what's really funny about this photo is I'm actually still very good friends with most of these kids on the screen, but this woman on the top right here, she's not only a good family friend, but I happened to teach her grandson. He was one of my preschoolers a few years back. So that was really special how it had come full circle. And her husband is in charge of the Intermountain Jewish News out there. And he even did an article on the graduation when we all had our graduation, because it really was a neat experience to have come full circle. So as I said, growing up, very common. Friday night, I invited friends over. If they wanted to come over and hang out, they had to come over to my house. We would have Shabbos dinner at family and friends' houses, of course. All of the Jewish holidays were very common, very normal. And I was a part of NCSY, a part of Hadassah, a part of USY, and a part of Nifty. But I wasn't a part of them necessarily by choice initially. When I hit 6th grade, I realized that I was kind of sheltered. I started realizing that there was more to the outside world than this upper middle class lifestyle that I was living. And so I had the very hard conversation with my parents about going to public school, because ultimately what I really wanted was to make a Black friend. I had never really met a Black person before. I had come into contact with Black people and other races, but I had never actually had a friend. And I wanted something like that. So I begged my family to let me go for middle school to public school. And after a lot of conversation, they said yes, but I had to do Jewish things. So that's when I started joining all of the Jewish things I could think of. I was joining every group, not and every denomination also. I didn't care because I had friends from all different denominations. I just wanted to show that I could do this. I was going to still stay me because I never was going to lose sight of who I was, but I really wanted to explore and learn more. So enter this guy. This, he already knows, his picture is being shown here, by the way. This is my friend Tyler. Tyler was the first person I sat next to the first day of 7th grade. And we are still friends to this day. And that is his beautiful daughter. I just, for brevity, wanted to keep her safe. So that is him and his daughter now. And he sat next to me and he told me that he had never met anybody Jewish before, even though there were Jews in my middle school. There weren't very many, and he had said he'd never met a Jewish girl before, and he actually was really interested in what that meant. So my entire semester of sitting next to him in this one class, I just taught him everything I knew, all of the holidays that were coming up, everything, and he loved it so much so that he still to this day will text me and say, I want to tell my daughter something. And so it's really, really, really nice to have that conversation and still be able to be friends with him as well. And then growing up in high school, it was still the same. I still had to stay home for a Shabbos dinner. There were still things that I had to get done in life that a normal teenager would have to get done. But there were stipulations because I might have to skip school to go to shul a couple days, if there was a holiday that fell over the week, I would miss school for it. And my family would write a note and everything would be totally fine. Everything was normal. I didn't really have any hardships like I have been hearing about, thank God. And I have to say thank you to all of you that really paved that path, because that was a huge thing. So as I grew up in high school, I joined everything, including joining my favorite thing, which was choir, which led me to meeting some pretty incredible people who, again, I'm still friends with today, of all different races, as you can see from this picture. Everybody, and I love each one of these people very, very much to this day. And in fact, one of them was my roommate up until I moved here. And she was this one right here, she was my favorite because she always knew when the Eruv was down, because we lived in like a Kemp Mill area type of town in Denver, and she knew whenever the Eruv was up or down, and she would let me know every Friday, and she would let my father know every Friday that the Eruv was up or down. It was very fun. But I liked teaching, and I also liked music, and that really led me to a path of exploring Jewish education, and what turned into more of a musical educator kind of situation. And I became a preschool teacher at a local synagogue for 11 years. And then I decided that I wanted to continue on and become a director. So I went to school and became certified to be a director. And then I moved here and I learned so much, so much. And I've been very blessed with a wonderful career and a wonderful community. And everybody here has been just wonderful. So I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you for paving the way. And like Tammy said, we are so grateful that we had the internet in some ways, because we have the opportunity to create our own Jewish paths where we weren't able to before, and in some ways bridge that gap that we may have struggled with growing up. And that's my talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian. I know you a little better. I've known you, I thought I knew you quite well, and now I know you a little more. I want to express for Sisterhood, thanks to each and every one of you for sharing with us how you began your Jewish identity. All of you have been very strong spokespersons for Yiddishkeit and a wonderful part of the tapestry of our congregation. With that, I'm going to go to the chat room. There is a question for Shirley, and I think maybe I will also ask, well, first Shirley, because that's who it's for. Shirley, were you penalized? This is from Rochelle. Were you penalized when you stayed out for Jewish holidays, or were the schools closed since you were in such a Jewish neighborhood?
Yeah, no, we were not penalized. I'm listening to all these talks, and I realized that some of the experiences people have had, for example, I'm a little embarrassed that I didn't include more of the Jewish things that we did, like cleaning the stove with my mother the day before Passover, things like that. But it's sort of representative of how I grew up. It was just so taken for granted. Everybody for blocks around was Jewish, and there was no penalty for staying home and we stayed home on lots of holidays, not just Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So it was, I was listening to everybody and all their background and experiences. The girls did not go, excuse me, the girls did not go to Hebrew school at all. This was depression. And and besides, there were girls. I mean, they didn't go to Hebrew school or anything like that. You just sort of absorbed everything through your skin. And so I'm a little embarrassed how little of the Yiddishkeit I put in my little talk, because I just read what was going on at the time, and that's how it felt.
Thank you. I'd also like to hear from Marcy. Marcy, did you stay home for the holidays? And if you did, were you penalized?
I did stay home for the holidays. I don't recall ever being penalized or anything. I think that people just kind of accepted that, okay, she's out. My parents also, I know several times when I was growing up, whisked me off to Florida for a month, and the teachers had no problems with that either. So I don't recall. Actually, I recall more of having problems when I was working. For my first job, I was working at Kodak, and when I would ask for time off, they were like, "You have to conform to the Christian world." And I was like, well, I'm not Christian and I don't have to conform. And if you want me to work on Christmas, I'll be happy to, because it's not a holiday for me. But growing up, I think I was more of an oddity than anything else.
I have a question that I'd like to put to Marcy and then Eileen. When did you first realize that you were Jewish as opposed to being part of the larger community? Marcy?
Well, probably from the time I was little, because, we just had Shabbat dinner every night. We lit, Fridays we had big Shabbat lunch. Every Saturday we lit candles, and I think from the beginning, I knew I was Jewish and the community around me wasn't. And it wasn't presented as anything different. It was just, you know, you're Jewish and this is what we do. And that was it. You just
Eileen,
accepted it.
I remember like my mother, I remember my mother buying me my first dress for my consecration service. I mean, it was a big deal. She bought me this really nice dress. I was like 4 years old. I remember standing there with all the other little my classmates, that these kids were going to be my classmates for like the next 10 years. And we, you know, but I do remember going to a store as a little child, and Santa came up to me and wanted to know what I wanted for Christmas. And I thought to myself, this guy is not very smart. Santa is not that smart, because he should know I'm a little Jewish girl and he's not coming to my house. And yeah, I mean, like, it was very, you have to understand, my mother was my mother is one of these people who's very proud of being an American. She's very proud of being an American. And that is very important to her. Like we didn't ever have Christmas decorations or anything, and we always celebrated Hanukkah. But my mother would let us dye Easter eggs. Don't ask me what the difference is, but we dyed Easter eggs. And we used to get an chocolate Easter bunny the day after Easter, because they go on sale the day after Easter. But I can't remember not knowing that we were Jewish.
To me, same thing. How did Christmas celebrations with Santas and the decorations in the stores make you feel? I'm going to ask that question of Elaine and Diane. Because even if your homes were totally Jewish, if you went in a store in December, it was a Christmas store. Carols were playing and Santa's sitting on his throne and decorations. How did that make you feel, Diane?
I, to this day, love the decorations. I love looking at department store windows and seeing the colors, the bright lights. And in Duluth growing up, it was interesting. It was colorful. But when we were in shul or at home, there was no Christmas. I mean, it was like a closed door, and that's how we celebrated with our people in the synagogue. So, yeah, best of both worlds, as I call it.
Elaine, what about you?
Well, you know, my mother wasn't happy to take us downtown to see Santa Claus. And she would take us to the she loved China, and she would schlep us to China, you know, to see the China, what a 7 and 8 and 10-year-olds. It was funny. And she didn't like us to see the Christmas things, but we did go downtown, but we never went up to Santa Claus. That was a no-no. And we just did Hanukkah things. And I was perfectly happy with that, because I always, like I told you before, those 3 little girls wouldn't talk to me for a month because I killed their Lord. So, you know, so I had my feelings about Christmas were not as exciting as it is to other people, including Jews. But I will say this, that working at TJ Maxx, I was very happy to see that they brought in Hanukkah things, many Hanukkah things, that at my store that I work in. And I was very happy about that, because a lot of people did come in and say, because Alney has a lot of Jews. And I think they were very happy to see that we had many Jewish items, toys and things. And candles, or all kinds of things. It was very pretty. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Would you change anything about your Jewish education? I'm going to ask the only two here that went to a Jewish day school, Adrian and Tammy. Adrian, you first. Would you change anything about your Jewish education?
I don't think so, because I think I became well-rounded as the way it turned out, because I made sure that my Jewish heritage always was up front and center, and that was always a part of me and who I am. And I don't think my education had anything to do with it. That being said, at times I do regret leaving the community that I was in because their bonds became stronger staying together throughout high school, middle school and high school, where I had decided to go. But as far as education, no, I think I had a great education.
Tammy?
Yeah,
you-
I would agree. It was, I learned so much. And it was challenging. It was hard. We did all sorts of, Hebrew. We learned Torah, Tanakh. We learned law. We learned philosophy. From obviously simpler in grade school, moving on to high school, and then we had the regular curriculum we had to learn. And for me, that was great. The more you give me to learn, the happier I am, and just having a solid foundation and knowledge to then, go off and do whatever. I wouldn't change that for a thing. I liked being in an all-girls school. That was nice. We could, be ourselves without worrying about boy-girl issues that I appreciated. So yeah, there's not really much I would change. Although with the Yiddish stuff, I'm starting to think now, like, why didn't we learn that? But I think we were learning, Torah style Hebrew. We were learning modern Hebrew. Maybe it would have been a little too much. But other than that, there's nothing I would change.
Thanks. The next question for me, what part did your grandparents play in your life? I'm going to ask Eileen and Shirley. Eileen first.
Well, unfortunately, I'm actually named for my grandmother because she died in February and I was born in April on my mother's side. And my grandfather died when my mother was a teenager. He passed away. And on my father's side, my father was from St. Louis, and his parents both passed away when I was 5 years old. So I really had very little knowledge of having grandparents. What it was like, it was almost like non-existent in my life to have knowing what other kids were doing with grandparents, because by the time I was 5 years old, I had none.
I never met my.
I'm sorry about that, because grandparents are very important. Not that I'm a presenter, but I really only had a grandmother in my life, but she lived a long time and she was with me until not with me personally, but in my life until I was in my 30s. And that was a blessing. So I am sorry about that. Shirley, what about you?
Well, my father's father died when he was about 10 years old. And if I'm remembering right, my father said he really had 2 bar mitzvahs because he was called to the Torah way before 13 and then again at 13, but because of his father dying. His mother lived across the city from us. Very interesting that my 2 brothers would go visit my father's mother when he did, but I hung out more with my mother. It wasn't a choice. It's just that's how things were. boys hung out with their father. My mother's mother died when I was about 4. One of my early memories is when she babysat for me. Was much younger than that, and I was sitting on the table, and she was brushing my hair. It's a rather vivid memory, just out of isolated, all by itself. My mother's father, he lived until I was like late teen. He said to me, I hope you'll get married early because I like to wear a tuxedo. And he was the old age of 70 at the time when he said this. So I remember more than anything. I'd also had a great grandmother, Baba Buna, who was a very little lady. And I just have a mental image of her, but I really didn't know her. She lived, I was alive when she was still here, but didn't really have an influence. So I guess you'd say my mother's father is the only one that really had an influence.
And my last question to everyone, and I'm going to go in order of your presentation. So I'll start with Shirley and then Elaine, Diane, Eileen, Marcy, Tammy, and then Adrian. What part does the state of Israel play in your Jewish identity as a young person and today? Shirley.
Well, as a young person, the state of Israel was not a state of Israel because, it just wasn't there. If you met somebody from Palestine, they were a Palestinian at that time was a Jew from Palestine. That's what a Palestinian was. So it was very exciting when Truman recognized them as a country, because we always say next year in Jerusalem, and we never expected really in our lifetime to see that. So yeah, I'm attached to Israel. I think it's a very good thing.
Elaine, what part does the state of Israel play in your life as a child? With me too, it was Palestine. But then in 1948, it became the state of Israel. What part does it play in your life? Elaine, you're muted. Unmute yourself. We cannot hear you.
Okay.
Okay,
You hear me
now,
now?
yes.
Okay. My father's family came from Germany, so they most of them went to Israel in the early 30s, just before Hitler really was killing everybody. And then some got to the United States. My one aunt, she stayed in Israel in 1948. I was a little girl then, so I'm not sure. But that part of the family, my father's family, came to the United States from that time, Palestine. And then everybody from my mother's family was from Austria, and they were here. They all came here. But when it comes to Israel, I love Israel. I've been there 40 some times. My Michael, God bless him, lives there and has for the last 20 some years. And whenever I say, oh, are you coming home to visit? He says, I am home. But I pray for Israel that they have peace, because it's never really been peaceful, even though right now we don't hear too many horrible things. But I pray for Israel all the time, and I do love Israel.
Diane.
Oh, at a young age, I dreamt of going to Israel. And in 72, I went. I met my grandfather's sister's family who moved to Israel. He came to America. They went to Israel. I worked the land. I love living on a kibbutz and touring, as I said, from north to south. And the rest is history. I married an Israeli twice. We have a large extended family over there, and it's a part of me. It's my life. It's my home away from home.
It truly is, Diane. Marcy,
Growing up, I don't think, I would hear about Israel, but as a child, it's just, it could have been Ohio. It just didn't seem someplace I could get to easily. I mean, it was part of Jewish education that, yes, you heard about Israel, but it was more in the historical sense. And of course, I married an Israeli, so of course I've been there since, and it's a very different experience now. But also, I went to a Sunday school and an after-school Hebrew school, so my Jewish education is not the day school education. It was something that I kind of had to do because that's what my parents wanted me to do. I don't think I really thought about it too much, but because of my Sunday school and after school Hebrew school, I made sure my kids went to day school.
and you married an Israeli.
And I married an Israeli. That was not planned, but it just happened.
Thank you. Tammy?
I've been lucky enough I think my parents would take the family every other year. My mother's older brother back then lived in Beersheba, and they have 5 children. So there's sort of extended family and cousins there. So it's a little bit like a home away from home. I, again, was lucky enough to study there after high school. And then again in college, I did a year abroad at Hebrew U studying biology in Hebrew, which was interesting because a lot of that Hebrew was sort of made up, what appeared to be on the spot. But just the beauty, the people, the coming from Toronto, where, it's snow and hockey, to beaches and palm trees, just that alone was enough to hook me. But and then also not having that feeling of being a minority, of having weird outfits or weird holidays because everyone there is, celebrating the same thing you are. So just in my heart, in a very special place for me.
Thank you. I went one time when my husband and I went to Israel, it was during the winter, and it was during, which would be here, the Christmas season. And there, you didn't even know it was Christmas. It was such a strange feeling for me, and a lovely feeling at the same time. And now, Adrian, how does Israel put, what place does Israel have in your life then and now?
Israel is very near and dear to my heart then and now. I had my bat mitzvah in Israel at a really lovely biblical landscape called Neot Kedumim. If you've never been there, I highly recommend going. It's absolutely gorgeous. And while I was chanting my Haftarah, a donkey happened to chant along with me. So that is in our family videos somewhere, I'm sure. And also I went on the Israel study tour, which happens the summer between your junior and senior year of high school for kids who have never been on any kind of program before, any high school program. And it was catered toward the Colorado-based community. And so I did that, and it was amazing. I did Poland for a week and then Israel for 6 weeks. And it was an experience I'll never forget. And in the meantime, between my love of just our community in general, I always have had just such a love for Israel too, of course. I have lots of family there. I have lots of friends there, some of whom you've met throughout the years that I've been in the Silver Spring community. And my Rhythm and Ruach program as well is very geared toward the Zionist community. I always do what I call my Hallelujah medley in the middle of the program, and I have to always, always, always include Am Yisrael Chai to make sure that we never forget and we always have Israel close to our hearts. So that's how I feel.
Thank you. That really does conclude our program. I want to thank everybody for attending our program. I also want to express my appreciation again to the panel who have shared insights into their lives. You really, all of you, have enriched every single person who was lucky enough to attend. We hope that our audience will return for more of our Zoom programs, and one day soon, join us in person. And if you do, our sisterhood will welcome you with open arms. And with that, I want to say good afternoon. And if you, here's a commercial for the synagogue. If you want to Zoom into Mincha Maariv, that will take place at 6:30 this evening on the same Zoom that you are on today. Bye.